The fine arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-January, tucked inside a crisp white envelope with the Pinewood Heights HOA logo stamped in the corner. And I knew before opening it that my quiet life in northern Wisconsin was about to get very complicated. I stood in my kitchen, still wearing my thermal overalls from my early morning ride, and stared at the letter. $500 for excessive noise disturbance and unauthorized recreational vehicle operation in violation of community standards. The letter was signed by Patricia Hendricks, HOA president, in looping cursive that somehow managed to look both elegant and threatening at the same time. My name is Ryan Richardson, and I had moved to this property 3 years ago after selling my tech consulting business in Chicago. I wanted peace, quiet, and enough land to enjoy my hobbies without anyone breathing down my neck. What I got was a 4-bedroom log home on 68 acres of pristine Wisconsin wilderness, complete with forests, a small lake, and trails that I had spent 2 summers improving and maintaining. The house itself sat in Pinewood Heights, a development of about 40 homes that had been carved out of what used to be logging territory back in the 70s. I read the letter again, my coffee getting cold on the counter. According to Patricia, I had been operating my snowmobile at unreasonable hours and creating a public nuisance for the past 3 weekends. The fine was due within 14 days, and failure to pay would result in additional penalties and possible legal action. The thing was, I had been riding my snowmobile. Every Saturday and Sunday morning at around 7, I would fire up my Polaris and spend a couple hours cruising the trails on my property. The trails connected to a larger network that wound through the woods behind the development, eventually leading to some beautiful overlooks and frozen streams that made winter in Wisconsin actually enjoyable. I had always assumed those trails were public land, or at least shared recreational space. I pulled out my property documents that afternoon, spreading them across my dining room table. The deed, the survey maps, the title insurance paperwork. I had reviewed all of this when I bought the place, but I had been more focused on the house itself and the immediate acreage around it. Now I traced the property lines with my finger, following the surveyor's descriptions and comparing them to the topographical maps I kept for hiking purposes. That was when I found it. A separate document, tucked behind the main deed, titled Secondary Parcel Acquisition. My real estate attorney had mentioned something about this during closing, but I had been signing so many papers that day that it had not fully registered. According to this document, my purchase had included not just the 68 acres around my home, but an additional 142 acres of what was described as recreational timberland with established trail system. I sat back in my chair, my heart starting to pound. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the county assessor's website, typing in my address. Sure enough, both parcels were listed under my name. The second parcel was a long, irregular strip of land that started at my back fence line and extended north and west, wrapping around the back side of the Pinewood Heights development like a horseshoe. I pulled up the trail maps I had made on my GPS unit from my rides. The trails I had been using were not just on my property. They were my property, every single mile of them. The previous owner, according to my research, had been a logging company that had maintained these trails for equipment access. When they sold off parcels for residential development, they had kept this strip as an access corridor. And when I bought my house, that corridor had been bundled into the sale, probably because no one else wanted to deal with maintaining it. I spent the next 2 hours making phone calls. First to my real estate attorney, who confirmed everything after digging through his files. Yes, I owned the trails. Yes, they were private property. No, there was no easement or public access agreement on record. The attorney sounded almost apologetic, as if he should have made this clearer at the time. Then I called the county clerk's office. A bored-sounding woman named Marie pulled up the records and confirmed that parcel 847-392-0847 was deeded to me, Ryan Richardson, with no encumbrances, liens, or public access provisions. When I asked if the Pinewood Heights HOA had any claim to the land, she actually laughed. "Honey, the HOA doesn't own anything except the common areas inside the development. That is roads, the little park, and the drainage ponds. Everything outside the plat boundaries is private property." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. The people of Pinewood Heights had been using my trails for years, probably decades. Snowmobiles in winter, ATVs in summer, hikers year-round. They had just assumed it was public land or maybe part of some informal arrangement. And now their HOA president had decided to fine me for using my own property. I looked at the fine notice again, and something cold settled in my chest. It was not anger exactly, more like clarity. Patricia Hendricks had made a mistake, and I was going to have to educate her about property rights in Wisconsin. The next morning, I drove to the Pinewood Heights HOA office, which was really just a converted garage at the front of the development. Patricia was there, as I knew she would be. She was the type of HOA president who treated her volunteer position like a full-time job, complete with office hours posted on the door. She looked up when I walked in, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Patricia was probably in her mid-50s, with blonde hair that was definitely from a bottle and a string of pearls that seemed like overkill for a Wednesday morning in rural Wisconsin. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice cool, "I assume you received our notice." "I did," I said, staying calm. I placed the letter on her desk. "I am here to discuss it." "There is nothing to discuss. The fine stands. Your snowmobile noise has been disturbing residents, and your use of the community trails without permission violates our recreational use policies." "Community trails," I repeated. "Tell me, Patricia, who owns those trails?" She blinked. "They are public land. They have been here since before the development was built." "Actually, they are not public land." I pulled out a folder I had prepared, containing copies of my deed, the county assessor's records, and a highlighted survey map. "They are my land. I own every inch of those trails, have since I bought my house 3 years ago." The color drained from Patricia's face as she looked at the documents. She flipped through them, her lips moving silently as she read. When she looked up, her expression had hardened. "That cannot be right. Everyone uses those trails. They have always been available." "Available, maybe, but not public, and definitely not owned by the HOA. I kept my voice level. "The previous owner allowed informal access, but there is no legal easement. The land is mine, and I have been paying taxes on it for 3 years. Patricia's hands were shaking slightly. "You cannot just close the trails. People have been using them for 30 years. "I am not saying I will close them," I said, though the idea was starting to form in my mind. "I am saying you do not get to fine me for using my own property. I want this fine rescinded, and I want a formal apology from the HOA board." She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I will do no such thing. This is clearly some kind of clerical error. Those trails belong to everyone." "Check with your attorney if you do not believe me," I said. "But the fine is not getting paid. And Patricia, you might want to be nicer about this. Because right now, you and everyone else in this development are trespassing on my land every time you use those trails." I left before she could respond, but I could feel her glaring at my back as I walked out. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a guy named Douglas Pemberton from a firm in Green Bay. The letter was polite but firm. It acknowledged that I appeared to own the trail land, but argued that decades of continuous public use had created an implied easement. They requested a meeting to discuss reasonable access arrangements and suggested that closing the trails would be contrary to community values and neighborly conduct. I called my attorney, who laughed when I read him the letter. Implied easement. That is a stretch. Wisconsin does recognize prescriptive easements, but they would need to prove open, continuous, and hostile use for 20 years, and they would need to prove it against you specifically. You have only owned it for 3 years. They can try, but they will lose. So what do I do? Whatever you want. It is your land. You can close it, you can charge access fees, you can let them keep using it for free. Entirely up to you. I thought about Patricia's face, the way she had dismissed me, the arrogance in her assumption that she could fine me for using my own property. I thought about the letter, which had not included an apology or even an acknowledgement that the fine was unjustified. I want to close it, I said. There was a pause. You are sure? That is going to make you very unpopular. I am sure. What do I need to do? My attorney walked me through the process. First, I needed to post clear no trespassing signs along the property boundaries. Then, I should send a formal notice to the HOA and the county informing them that the land was private and that public access was no longer permitted. After that, it was a matter of enforcement. I spent the following Saturday installing signs. I bought 50 of them from a farm supply store in Rhinelander, heavy-duty metal signs that read, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." I used my snowmobile to haul them out, along with a post-hole digger and a bag of concrete mix. The temperature was below 0, and the work was brutal. But there was something satisfying about it, pounding those posts into the frozen ground every 100 yards along the trail system. By the time I finished, it was dark, and my hands were numb even inside my insulated gloves. On Sunday, I had my attorney send the formal notice. It went to Patricia, to the HOA board, to the county, and to the local sheriff's office, just to make sure everyone was on the same page. The letter was straightforward. The trails were private property. Access was no longer permitted. Anyone found on the trails after February 1st would be considered a trespasser. I gave them 2 weeks. It seemed fair. The response was immediate and explosive. By Monday afternoon, my phone was ringing nonstop. I let most of the calls go to voicemail. The messages ranged from angry to pleading to outright threatening. One guy, who identified himself as Todd from Maple Street, told me he had been using those trails since 1992, and that I had no right to take them away. A woman named Jennifer said her kids loved hiking there, and that I was ruining their childhood. Patricia herself left 3 messages, each one more furious than the last, demanding that I call her back immediately. I did not call anyone back. Instead, I went out for another ride on my snowmobile, enjoying the crisp morning air and the way the sun glinted off the snow-covered pines. On Wednesday, I got a knock on my door. I opened it to find Patricia standing on my porch, along with 2 other people I recognized from HOA meetings I had been forced to attend over the years. One was a tall guy named Carl, who I think was the HOA vice president. The other was a woman named Susan who always wore too much perfume. "We need to talk," Patricia said without preamble. "I do not think we do," I replied. "I have been pretty clear about my position." "You are being unreasonable," Carl said. His voice had that practiced calmness that told me he thought he was the reasonable one here. Those trails are important to the community. People depend on them for recreation. Then the community should have thought about that before fining me for using my own property. Susan stepped forward, her expression sympathetic. Ryan, I understand you are upset about the fine. That was clearly a mistake, but you cannot punish the whole neighborhood for Patricia's error. I am not punishing anyone, I said. I am simply exercising my property rights. You do not have permission to use my land. It is that simple. We will take you to court, Patricia said, her face flushed. We will sue you for that easement and we will win. Go ahead, I said, but you might want to check with your attorney first. Because, from what I understand, you do not have a case, and legal fees are expensive, especially when you are spending HOA money on a losing battle. I closed the door before any of them could respond. Through the window, I watched them walk back to Carl's SUV, Patricia gesturing angrily the whole way. The next few days were tense. Someone spray-painted "selfish jerk" on my mailbox. I filed a police report and installed a security camera. The messages kept coming, some of them now openly hostile. One email from an address I did not recognize said I should watch my back because accidents happen in the woods. I forwarded that one to the sheriff's office. February 1st arrived, and I made a point of riding my trails early that morning. Sure enough, I found fresh snowmobile tracks that were not mine. Someone had decided to test my resolve. I took pictures with my phone, noting the time and location, and sent them to my attorney. That afternoon, I went out again and found 2 snowmobiles parked near one of the overlooks. 2 men were standing there, both in their 40s, drinking beer and acting like they owned the place. I recognized one of them from the neighborhood, a guy named Brad who lived on Spruce Lane. I pulled up on my sled and killed the engine. You guys need to leave. This is private property. Brad turned to me, his expression defiant. We have been coming here for 15 years. You do not get to just kick us out. Actually, I do. You are trespassing. The other guy, who I did not know, stepped forward. What are you going to do about it? Call the cops. They have better things to do than deal with this petty bullshit. Maybe, I said, but I will call them anyway, and I will press charges, and you will end up with a criminal record over a snowmobile ride. Is that really worth it? Brad looked at his friend and something passed between them. Finally, Brad shook his head. Whatever, man. You are a real piece of work, you know that. They left, their sleds kicking up rooster tails of snow. I stayed there for a while, looking out at the view they had been enjoying. It was beautiful, the kind of scene that belonged on a postcard. Frozen lake, snow-covered trees, the sun starting to dip toward the horizon. I understood why people loved these trails. I loved them too. But that did not give them the right to treat me like I was the villain for asserting my ownership. A week later, the HOA filed their lawsuit. I was not surprised. Douglas Pemberton, their attorney, was arguing for a prescriptive easement based on decades of community use. The complaint was filled with testimonials from residents about how important the trails were, how they had relied on them for years, how closing them was damaging property values and quality of life. My attorney filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA had no standing to claim an easement against me since the use had been permitted by the previous owner, not adverse. We also pointed out that none of the current residents could claim 20 years of continuous use against me specifically, since I had only owned the property for 3 years. The case was assigned to Judge Theodore Martinez in Oneida County Circuit Court. The hearing was scheduled for late March. In the meantime, the harassment continued. Someone slashed my tires. Someone else threw a rock through my front window. I installed more cameras, upgraded my security system, and started documenting everything. The sheriff's office was sympathetic, but admitted they did not have the resources to patrol my property 24/7. I also started noticing that certain people in the neighborhood were freezing me out. The woman at the local hardware store, who had always been friendly, now barely acknowledged me. The guy who ran the gas station near the highway would not make eye contact. It was like I had become a pariah. Only a few people were supportive. My nearest neighbor, an elderly man named George who lived a half-mile down the road, stopped by one afternoon with a bottle of whiskey. "Heard about your troubles," he said, settling into my couch. "HOAs are poison. I made sure to buy outside their boundaries for that exact reason." "You think I am wrong?" I asked. George shrugged. "I think you are within your rights, but I also think you are in for a hell of a fight. People around here do not like change, and they really do not like being told no." "I did not start this," I said. "Patricia started it when she fined me." "True enough, but you are the one who escalated it, not saying that is wrong, just saying it is going to cost you." He was right, of course. But I was in too deep to back down now. The hearing in March was standing room only. It seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up, packing the small courtroom in the Oneida County Courthouse in Rhinelander. Patricia sat in the front row with Douglas Pemberton, looking confident. Carl and Susan were there too, along with a dozen other residents I recognized. Judge Martinez was a no-nonsense guy in his 60s, with silver hair and a reputation for not tolerating bullshit. He listened to Pemberton's arguments for about 20 minutes, occasionally asking questions. Pemberton tried to paint me as a selfish newcomer who was destroying a community tradition for no good reason. Then my attorney, Michael Grant, stood up. He was younger than Pemberton but sharper, and he had prepared meticulously for this hearing. He walked the judge through the property records, the survey maps, the complete absence of any recorded easement or access agreement. He pointed out that prescriptive easements required adverse use against the actual owner, and that I had only owned the property for 3 years. He also noted that I had never given permission for the use, which meant the clock on any prescriptive easement claim would have to start from my ownership, not from the previous owner's period. Pemberton tried to argue that the use had been so open and notorious that I should have known about it, and that my failure to object earlier implied consent. Michael countered that I had not objected because I had not realized I owned the trails until the HOA fined me, and that I had acted promptly once I became aware. Judge Martinez listened to both sides, then leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Pemberton, I am going to be honest with you. Your claim is weak. Mr. Richardson owns the property. There is no recorded easement. The use by your clients, while long-standing, was permissive under the previous owner and cannot be considered adverse. You have no case for a prescriptive easement against Mr. Richardson." Patricia's face went pale. Carl looked like he had been punched in the gut. "However," the judge continued, looking at me now, "I am troubled by this situation. It seems to me that this dispute arose from a misunderstanding and has been escalated by both sides. Mr. Richardson, would you be willing to consider some form of limited access agreement? Perhaps a revocable license for trail use with reasonable conditions?" I stood up, and every eye in the courtroom turned to me. I thought about Patricia's fine, about the spray paint on my mailbox, about the rock through my window, about the messages calling me selfish and threatening me with accidents in the woods. "No, Your Honor, I would not." There was a murmur through the courtroom. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. "May I ask why not?" "Because the HOA president fined me $500 for using my own property, and when I pointed out that the trails were mine, she refused to apologize or rescind the fine. Because members of that HOA have vandalized my property, threatened me, and tried to intimidate me into giving up my legal rights. I am happy to be neighborly, Your Honor, but not with people who treat me like this." The judge was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I see. Well, Mr. Richardson, you are within your rights to deny access to your property. The motion to dismiss is granted. The HOA's complaint is dismissed with prejudice. The gavel came down, and it was over. Pemberton gathered his papers, looking deflated. Patricia stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me. Carl and Susan followed, along with the rest of the crowd. Outside, Michael clapped me on the shoulder. You won. Congratulations. Does not feel like winning, I said. It will, give it time. But time did not make it better. If anything, the hostility intensified. The HOA sent me a new fine, this time for failure to maintain property aesthetics, because apparently one of my shed doors was slightly faded. I ignored it. They sent another fine for unauthorized fence installation, even though I had not installed any fence. I ignored that too. In late April, someone cut down 3 of my no trespassing signs and threw them in my driveway. I replaced them and added more cameras. In May, I caught 2 teenagers on ATVs tearing up one of my trails. I called the sheriff, and they were cited for trespassing. Their parents, both Pinewood Heights residents, tried to have the charges dropped, claiming the kids did not know they were on private property. The charges stuck. By June, I was exhausted. The constant conflict was wearing me down. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake, if I should have just paid the original $500 fine and moved on with my life. Then, I got a call from a development company out of Minneapolis. They had heard about my property and were interested in discussing a potential purchase. The guy on the phone, a smooth-talking executive named Richard, explained that they were looking for land to develop into a private recreational resort. My trails, he said, would be perfect. We are talking about a high-end, members-only facility, Richard said. Luxury cabins, guided tours, maybe a small restaurant and lodge. Very tasteful, very exclusive. And we would be willing to pay a premium for the trail parcel. We are thinking somewhere in the range of $2.5 million. I almost dropped the phone. $2.5 million. For the trails. The trails and the development rights, yes. It is a unique property, Mr. Richardson. There are not many parcels like that available in northern Wisconsin. I told him I would think about it and hung up. $2.5 million. That was more than twice what I had paid for my entire property, house included. I could sell the trails, pocket the money, and let someone else deal with the headaches. But the more I thought about it, the less I liked the idea. A resort would mean even more traffic, more noise, more people tramping through the woods. It would also mean construction, clear cutting, and permanent changes to the landscape I had come to love. And while I had no love for the Pinewood Heights HOA, I did not necessarily want to punish the land itself. I called Richard back and declined the offer. He seemed surprised but said the door was always open if I changed my mind. Summer passed, and things quieted down. The HOA stopped sending fines, probably because I had stopped paying attention to them. The vandalism decreased, though I suspected that had more to do with my security cameras than any change of heart from my neighbors. People still avoided me in town, but I was getting used to being the pariah. In September, I got a new knock on my door. This time it was not Patricia but Susan, the woman who had come with her back in February. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her purse strap. Ryan, I was hoping we could talk. I considered closing the door but decided to hear her out. What about? The trails, and Patricia. I stepped aside and let her in. We sat in my living room and she took a deep breath. Patricia was removed as HOA president last month. There was a special election. She had been spending HOA money on the lawsuit without proper authorization, and people were furious. Carl is the new president. Good for Carl, I said, my tone neutral. He wants to apologize. We all do. What happened with the fine, with the way Patricia handled everything, that was wrong. We should have checked the property records. We should have talked to you like an adult instead of just sending threats and fines. Okay, I said. I appreciate that, but it does not change anything. I know, but Carl was wondering if you might reconsider the access situation. Not for free, she added quickly. We would be willing to negotiate a lease or an easement agreement. We could pay you an annual fee, maybe help with trail maintenance, whatever you think is fair. I leaned back in my chair, considering. How much are we talking about? Carl was thinking maybe $5,000 a year. We could take it from HOA dues. $5,000 a year. It was not nothing, but it was not a lot either, especially compared to the $2.5 million the developers had offered. On the other hand, it would be recurring income, and it would let me keep control of the trails. I will think about it, I said. Susan smiled, looking relieved. That is all we can ask. Thank you for listening, Ryan. After she left, I walked out to my back deck and looked at the woods. The leaves were starting to turn, splashes of red and gold among the green. I had moved here for peace, and instead I had gotten 3 years of conflict and stress. But I had also learned something about myself. I had learned that I was not willing to be pushed around, even by a whole neighborhood. I had learned that owning property meant something, that it came with both rights and responsibilities. I decided to take a few days to think about the HOA's offer. I wanted to see if Carl would follow through, if this was a genuine olive branch, or just another attempt to manipulate me. A week later, Carl himself came by. He was more subdued than I remembered from the courthouse, less confrontational. We sat on my deck, drinking coffee, and he told me the whole story. Patricia, it turned out, had been a nightmare as HOA president. She had been fining people left and right for minor infractions, using her position to settle personal grudges, and generally making everyone miserable. The lawsuit against me had been the last straw. When people found out she had spent nearly $30,000 in HOA funds on legal fees without a vote, there had been an uproar. She had been forced to resign, and the board was now trying to repair the damage. We are not asking you to forget what happened, Carl said. But we are asking for a chance to make things right. The trails matter to people, Ryan. Kids grew up hiking there, couples had their first dates there. It is part of the community's history. It is my property, I said quietly. I know, and we respect that. That is why we are offering to pay. We want a formal agreement, something legal and binding. You set the terms, we will agree to them. If we violate them, the agreement ends. Simple as that. I sipped my coffee, watching a hawk circle overhead. I want the $500 fine refunded. Done. I will write you a check today. I want a written apology from the HOA board, acknowledging that the fine was unjust and that the trails are my property. You will have it by the end of the week. And I want $10,000 a year, not $5,000. Plus, the HOA is responsible for all trail maintenance. Any damage caused by users, you fix. Any garbage left behind, you clean up. I am not running a charity here. Carl hesitated, then nodded. I will have to bring it to the board, but I think we can make that work. We shook hands and Carl left. 3 days later, I received a FedEx envelope containing a check for $500 and a letter signed by all 5 board members. The letter was brief but sincere, apologizing for the fine and acknowledging my ownership of the trails. It also thanked me for considering renewed access and expressed hope that we could move forward as neighbors. I had my attorney draft an access agreement. It was 10 pages long and covered everything from permitted uses to liability waivers to termination clauses. The HOA would pay me $10,000 annually, due every January 1st. They would be responsible for maintaining the trails, including clearing fallen trees, repairing erosion, and removing trash. Users would be limited to Pinewood Heights residents and their guests. No commercial use. No large groups without prior approval. No motorized vehicles except snowmobiles and ATVs on designated trails. And most importantly, the agreement could be terminated by me at any time with 90 days written notice if the HOA violated any terms. Carl brought it to the board and they approved it unanimously. We signed the agreement in early October with my attorney and their attorney both present. It felt strangely formal, like we were negotiating a corporate merger instead of trail access. But it worked. The first payment arrived on January 1st, right on schedule. The HOA organized volunteer days for trail maintenance, and I was surprised to see people actually showing up. They cleared brush, fixed bridges, and even installed a few benches at scenic overlooks. Some people still avoided me in town, but others nodded or waved when they saw me. A few even stopped to thank me for allowing access again. Patricia, I heard through the grapevine, had moved to Florida. No one seemed sorry to see her go. Life started to settle into a new normal. I rode my trails in the mornings, worked on my consulting projects in the afternoons, and enjoyed the quiet evenings. The hostility faded, replaced by something that was not quite friendship, but was at least civil coexistence. Then, in March of the second year of the agreement, I caught someone poaching on my land. I had gone out early on a Sunday morning and found a truck parked on one of the side trails, well off the main routes. Two men were field dressing a deer they had shot, clearly out of season and on private property. I called the sheriff immediately. Deputy Jake Morris, who I had gotten to know pretty well over the past few years, arrived within 20 minutes. The poachers tried to claim they had not seen the no trespassing signs, but Jake was not buying it. They were cited for poaching, trespassing, and hunting out of season. Their rifles were confiscated, and they faced hefty fines plus possible jail time. I expected the HOA to be upset, thinking maybe the poachers were residents, but Carl called me that evening to thank me for reporting it. "Those guys were not from Pinewood Heights," he said. "They were from some town down south, just looking for a place to hunt illegally. You did the right thing." It was a small thing, but it felt like a turning point. We were not adversaries anymore. We were neighbors who had come to an understanding. The years passed. The access agreement renewed automatically each year, and the payments kept coming. I made improvements to the trails, adding some new routes and better signage. The HOA appreciated it, and I appreciated their diligence in keeping things maintained. I even started attending the occasional HOA meeting, not as a member but as a guest, to discuss trail-related issues. In the fourth year, a developer approached the HOA about buying the entire Pinewood Heights development. It was a big company from Chicago, the kind that specialized in turning small neighborhoods into luxury communities with gates and fancy amenities. The offer was generous, enough that several residents were seriously considering selling. Carl called me one evening, sounding worried. "If this sale goes through, our access agreement might not survive. The new owners might not honor it, or they might demand different terms." "What do you want me to do about it?" I asked. "I do not know. I just thought you should know. If the neighborhood changes hands, things could get complicated again." I thought about it for a few days. Then I had an idea. I called a meeting with Carl and the HOA board along with my attorney. I laid out a proposal. "What if I granted you a permanent easement?" I said. "Not a lease, but an actual recorded easement for trail access. It would run with the land, meaning any future owner of Pinewood Heights would have the right to use the trails, and any future owner of my property would have to honor the easement. Susan, who was still on the board, looked surprised. Why would you do that? You would be giving up leverage. Because I am tired of fighting, I said honestly. And because I think we have proven that we can work together. The easement would have conditions, obviously. Maintenance responsibilities, usage restrictions, all the stuff in our current agreement. But it would be permanent, recorded with the county. You would not have to worry about losing access, and I would not have to worry about renegotiating every time something changes. Carl looked at my attorney. Is this for real? Michael nodded. It is his property. He can grant an easement if he wants. We would just need to draft it properly and get it recorded. The board voted on it and accepted. We spent the next month working out the details, making sure the easement language protected both sides. In the end, it was 15 pages of legal terminology that boiled down to a simple idea. Pinewood Heights residents could use the trails forever, as long as they followed the rules and kept up their end of the bargain. We recorded the easement in April, and it became part of the official property records for both my land and the Pinewood Heights development. When the Chicago developer heard about it, they withdrew their offer, apparently not interested in a property that came with permanent trail access obligations. Some residents were disappointed, but most seemed relieved. George, my elderly neighbor, stopped by again with another bottle of whiskey. "Heard what you did," he said, pouring us both a glass. "Granting that easement. That was a good thing, Ryan." "It felt right," I said. "Still, you gave up something valuable. That land would have been worth even more without the easement." "Maybe, but money is not everything." "I like it here, George. I like the trails, I like the woods. I even like most of the people now that Patricia is gone. If granting the easement means I can stop worrying about lawsuits and vandalism and all that other nonsense, it is worth it." George raised his glass. "To good neighbors." "To good neighbors," I echoed. But life had one more twist in store for me. In the fall of that year, the state of Wisconsin announced plans to expand the North Woods Trail System, a massive project connecting hundreds of miles of recreational trails across the northern part of the state. They were looking for private landowners who would be willing to grant easements or sell portions of their property to help complete the network. A representative from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources contacted me. Her name was Teresa Newton, and she was passionate about the trail project. She explained that my property was in a key location, bridging a gap between two existing trail systems. "If we could route the state trail through your land, it would open up access to thousands of acres of public forest," Teresa said. "We would pay you for the easement, of course, and we would handle all the maintenance and improvements." "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "For an easement corridor about 30 feet wide running through your property, we could offer $75,000. Plus, we would build a parking area and trailhead at your front boundary, which would increase your property value." I thought about it. $75,000 was nothing to sneeze at, and the idea of connecting my trails to a larger state system appealed to me. It would bring in more visitors, but they would be managed by the state, not by me. "What about my agreement with Pinewood Heights?" I asked. "I have an easement that gives them exclusive access." Teresa reviewed the easement document and smiled. "This only restricts access to Pinewood Heights residents. It does not prohibit you from granting additional easements to other parties. You would just need to make sure the state trail route does not interfere with their existing use." I worked with Teresa and my attorney to design a trail route that would run along the eastern edge of my property, connecting to the main trails, but not disrupting the areas Pinewood Heights residents used most. We also added a clause requiring the state to post signs explaining that portions of the trail system were on private property and subject to additional restrictions. The DNR accepted the terms, and I signed another easement. Construction began the following spring. They built a beautiful parking area with informational kiosks, restrooms, and a small picnic area. The trail itself was professionally groomed, with mile markers and bridges over the streams. When it opened in June, the response was overwhelming. Hikers, bikers, and nature enthusiasts came from all over Wisconsin to explore the new trail. My property became a small hub in the larger network, and I found myself enjoying the increased activity. People were respectful, following the rules and appreciating the natural beauty. Pinewood Heights residents adapted to the change. Some were initially concerned about the increased traffic, but the state trail users mostly stayed on their designated routes, and the DNR rangers did a good job of enforcement. If anything, the state trail made the Pinewood Heights trails less crowded since visitors now had more options. Carl stopped by one afternoon while I was working on my deck. "Wanted to thank you again," he said, "for everything. The easement, working with the state, all of it. You could have made our lives hell, but you did not." "You guys could have made my life hell too," I pointed out. "But after Patricia left, you chose to work with me instead. That made all the difference. Still, not many people would have done what you did." Granting that permanent easement, that was generous. I shrugged. "I learned something from all this, Carl. Property rights are important, and I will always stand up for them. But being right is not the same as being good. I could have kept those trails closed out of spite, but what would that have accomplished? Just more anger, more resentment. This way, everyone wins." Carl nodded, looking out at the woods. "You know, when you first moved here, people thought you were just another city guy looking for a vacation home. Someone who would show up a few weekends a year and then disappear. But you proved us wrong. You are part of this place now." "I guess I am," I said. As Carl left, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. It had started with a simple $500 fine and a HOA president who thought she could push me around. It had escalated into a legal battle, property vandalism, and a neighborhood feud that could have turned truly ugly. But in the end, we had found a way forward. Not through compromise exactly, but through a combination of standing firm on principles and being willing to find solutions that worked for everyone. I had not backed down from defending my property rights, but I also had not let anger and spite drive my decisions. The trails were still mine. I still owned every inch of them, and the deed was still in my name. But now they were also something more. They were a bridge between my property and the community, a shared resource that brought people together instead of driving them apart. Winter came again, and I fired up my Polaris for the first ride of the season. It was a Saturday morning just after 7, the same time that had gotten me fined all those years ago. The snow was perfect, fresh powder over a solid base. I rode for 2 hours, following the trails through the woods, past the overlooks, down to the frozen lake. Along the way, I passed other riders. Some were from Pinewood Heights, others were using the state trail system. Everyone waved. A few stopped to chat, thanking me for keeping the trails open and well-maintained. When I got back to my house, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, containing the annual access payment of $10,000, but there was also a note, handwritten by Carl. "Ryan, the board voted to increase the annual payment to $15,000 effective this year. It is the least we can do to show our appreciation. Thank you for being a good neighbor, Carl." I stood there in my driveway, holding the check and the note, and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Contentment, maybe even happiness. The story could have ended so differently. If I had been less principled, I might have just paid that original $500 fine and let Patricia walk all over me. If I had been more vindictive, I might have kept the trails closed forever, punishing an entire community for one woman's arrogance. If I had been more desperate for money, I might have sold out to the developers and let them turn the woods into a resort. But I had chosen a different path. I had fought for what was right, then worked to find solutions that honored both my rights and the community's needs. It had not been easy and it had not been fast, but it had been worth it. As I walked into my house, I thought about Patricia Hendricks, wherever she was in Florida. I wondered if she had learned anything from the experience, if she regretted the way she had handled things. Probably not. People like Patricia rarely saw themselves as the problem, but that was okay. I had learned plenty for both of us. I had learned that owning property was about more than just having a deed. It was about stewardship, about being part of a place and a community. I had learned that standing up for yourself did not mean being cruel or unreasonable. And I had learned that sometimes the best revenge was not revenge at all, but simply living well and finding ways to turn conflict into cooperation. The trails were mine. They would always be mine. But they were also ours, in a way that mattered more than any legal document could express. They were a piece of Wisconsin wilderness that we all shared, preserved and protected for future generations. And that, I thought as I hung up my snowmobile gear and poured myself a cup of coffee, was exactly how it should be. The fine that started everything was long forgotten, replaced by mutual respect and a genuine partnership. The battle over property rights had transformed into something better, something that benefited everyone involved. I settled into my favorite chair, looking out at the woods through my front window. Somewhere out there, people were hiking my trails, riding their snowmobiles, enjoying the beauty of northern Wisconsin. They were doing it with my permission, on my terms, but also with my blessing. Patricia had tried to fine me for using my own property. She had not known I owned the trails, and she had paid the price for her ignorance and arrogance. But in the end, her mistake had led to something positive. It had forced me to examine what I really owned and what it meant. It had sparked a conflict that, once resolved, made the community stronger. The HOA had tried to take away my rights, and I had banned their access forever, at least initially. But forever turned out to be less permanent than anyone expected. We had found a way forward that honored the past while building something new. As I sat there, comfortable in my home, surrounded by the wilderness I loved, I realized that this was what winning really looked like. Not a courtroom victory or a big payout, but a life lived on my own terms in a place I belonged, with neighbors I could respect. The trails would be there tomorrow and the day after that, and for years to come. They would change with the seasons, covered in snow in winter, green and lush in summer, painted in autumn colors every fall. But they would endure, a permanent part of the landscape, connecting my property to the community and the community to the wilderness beyond. And I would be there too, riding my snowmobile at 7 in the morning, hiking in the afternoons, watching the hawks circle overhead and the deer move through the trees. Living the life I had come here to find, the life I had fought to protect. No HOA fine could take that away from me. Not now, not ever.